Much of the cultural pattern of Southern rednecks became the cultural heritage of Southern blacks, more so than survivals of African cultures, with which they had not been in contact for centuries.
What are some of the things that make up culture? You have language, food, customs, values, you have attitudes, mannerisms, right? The way people dress, right? And so the people who identify as Black Americans, they don't share much of these cultural aspects with most of the people in Africa, right? Which is why I find it a bit odd for them to try and identify themselves as Africans, right? And so they became a completely different people with the experience of living in America, right? And so with that experience, they were given a new identity and then they adopted new cultural behaviors, right? Of which Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying that these cultural behaviors, much of it is from the Southern redneck culture, right? And so let's go ahead and keep reading in the book to see if we can get us some more understanding.
Even in colonial times, most blacks on American soil had been born on American soil.
The colonial time started in the 1500s and then went on into the time where the European rulers teamed up with the African rulers to capture and sell other native Africans to various parts of the world, right? And so in America, those Africans were socially invented into a new category called Negroes or Black people, right? And then they started mixing with other Europeans and other Native Americans. And then along with that, they also inherited and they developed a completely different culture than what was taking place in Africa, right? And they had to do this to adapt to the environment and the circumstances that they found themselves in, right? And so a new language they got, right? New foods, new ways of thinking about life, right? New ways of seeing themselves, right? New ways of dressing, new ways of just about everything. And so essentially they became a distinct people, right? And then it continued in colonial times that these distinct Black people, they were born right here on American soil.
Moreover, such cultural traits followed blacks out of the southern countrysides and into the urban ghettos, north and south, where many settled.
The cultural traits that the blacks developed in the setting of slavery and inherited from the rednecks were taken with them when they became physically free. And then they migrated into the inner cities in the areas of the northern and southern parts of America.
The very way of talking, later to be christened Black English, closely followed dialects brought over from these parts of Britain from which many white Southerners came, though these speech patterns died out in Britain while surviving in the American South, as such speech patterns would later die out among most Southern whites and among middle-class blacks while surviving in the poor Black ghettos around the country.
The way of talking called Ebonics or Black English, which does not come from Africa, but rather it comes from the region of Britain where these white Southerners came from, it influenced the way that the Black slave learned how to talk, right? And so the people in Britain, they stopped talking like this, most of them, right? And also the same thing happened with most of the white Southerners, right? They stopped talking like this. But the blacks, they kept it and they brought it into the ghetto, right? And then they took ownership of it, right? And so Dr. Thomas Sowell, he talks about how it died amongst the middle class blacks, but there's still a whole lot of them who feel that they need to copy this type of speaking in order for them to feel authentically Black, right? These people, they've grown up their entire lives, many of them in the suburbs, right? And in a completely different set of circumstances, right? But they still feel like they need to talk that way in order to feel like a typical Black person and fit into a typical Black culture.
For example, where a Northerner said, I am, you are, she isn't, it doesn't, and I haven't, a Virginian, even of higher rank, preferred to say, I be, you be, she ain't, it don't, and I hate. Virginia speechways were not invented in America. They derived from a family or regional dialects that had been spoken throughout the South and west of England during the 17th century. From these same regions of England came such words as yaller for yellow, axe for axe, across for across, y'all for you, bile for boil, dough for door, this for this, and dat for that. Many of these usages have long since died out in England, though the word chitlins for hog entrails continue to be used in some localities in England, even in the 20th century, as such usage remained common among Black Americans.
Even the word chitlins come from England.
But no such words came from Africa.
They don't come from Africa because the Africans don't speak that way, right? But the rednecks did, right? And they still do speak that way, right? And so here in Florida, you can come across a number of people, right? Which I have, a number of people who come from the backwoods of the country who still speak like this.
The slaves' custom of marking their marriages by jumping over a broomstick, a custom resurrected at a posh wedding among blacks in 20th century New York as a mark of racial identity, was in fact a pagan custom in Europe in centuries past and survived for a time among Southern whites.
Jumping over the broom in the wedding, that's not from Africa, that's from Europe.
Complaints about the improvidence of whites in the South and of their ancestors in Britain before that were echoed in Du Bois' picture of his fellow blacks in the 1890s.
Let's see what Du Bois had to say here.
Probably few poor nations waste more money by thoughtless and unreasonable expenditure than the American Negro, and especially those living in large cities. Thousands of dollars are annually wasted in amusements of various kinds, and in miscellaneous ornaments and gewgaws.
Do we still see this behavior of spending money thoughtlessly on entertainment and miscellaneous things by the American Negro? You tell me, right? Habits and cultural practices, they just don't go away, right? And so they get passed down parent to child, generation to generation, until people take it upon themselves to break the cycle, right? So now let's go ahead and see what else Du Bois has to say.
The Negro has much to learn of the Jew and the Italian as to living within his means and saving every penny from excessive and wasteful expenditures.
The Jews, and specifically the Hasidic Jews here in America, they're very good when it comes to money, right? And so they know how to save money, and they also know how to spend it wisely, and right, and understand that there's nothing wrong with learning from other people, right? Because it's not like people own the patent to the strategy of saving money and living within their means, right? It's just understand that some people, they just have practices that are better than other people's practices, right? When it comes to things in certain areas. And when it comes to things like money, the Jews, they're some of the best people to get these ideas from on how to deal with it, right? It just is what it is.
It was not, however, from Jews or Italians that blacks had absorbed their culture.
The majority of the European Jews and the Italians, they don't spend money lavishly, right? And they don't spend it out of control. So obviously the blacks, they didn't pick up this habit from them.
Du Bois' description of the spending habits of blacks in the 1890s was echoed by a contemporary observer, Jacob Riis, who said that the Negro loves fine clothes and good living a good deal more than he does a bank account.
This was said all the way back in the 1890s, right? And so can this still be said today?
Similar observations have been made by many others over the years, inside and outside of the black community. For the lower socioeconomic classes among blacks, Gunnar Myrdal's descriptions of them near the middle of the 20th century still bore a remarkable resemblance to descriptions of Southern whites and their regional forebears in Britain, including less resourcefulness, disorganized family life, lax sexual morals, and recklessness, with the tendencies toward aggression and violence.
If this is making someone mad, then that means that it's hitting a nerve. You feel that burn in the chest or in the stomach, it's getting to you, right? But getting mad, that doesn't do anything about it. All that does is just drive up the blood pressure, right? Because after all the getting angry is done and it's all over with, these cultural aspects, they're going to still be needing to be dealt with in order to climb out of the pit, right? So let's go ahead and get some more.
Despite a generally sympathetic approach to the study of blacks in his landmark book, An American Dilemma, which has often been credited with a major influence on the advancement of civil rights, Myrdal also noted the low standards of efficiency, reliability, ambition, and morals actually displayed by the average Negro. He observed something of the devil-may-care attitude in the pleasure-seeking of Negroes, and a general attitude in which life becomes cheap and crime not so reprehensible.
Too much pleasure-seeking and entertainment. Right? These are some of the attitudes and the cultural practices that the people outside can easily see that's keeping this group in the pit, right? And many of people, they're afraid to speak up in today's time because they think that if they do speak up, that they're going to be canceled, right? But I can care less about any of that type of stuff, right? So what needs to be said is what needs to be said.
Like other observers, Myrdal tended to attribute to slavery such aspects of black culture as the low regard for human life, when in fact antebellum whites had exhibited this same reckless disregard of lethal dangers, and so had their ancestors in Britain.
Now, slavery can't be excluded from the equation because what it did was it put the earlier ancestors in a predicament that made them have to pick from only the lowest rungs of cultural practices, right? So if slavery were not their environment that they were brought up in, the chances are they would have put together a much better culture, right? A much better culture from what they inherited and from what they developed within the American slavery, right? And so I see slavery as a major contributing factor, right? Even if they did pick up some of these other practices from these Southern whites, right? Because people in the pit, they learn from other people in the pit. That's how they stay in the pit, right? And so the Southern rednecks, they were definitely in the pit too.
Unlike many others, however, Murdahl also recognized the influence of the Southern white culture on the culture of blacks, pointing out that the general Southern pattern of illegality maintained this low regard for human life. He also noted that the so-called Negro dialect is simply a variation on the ordinary Southern accent, that religious emotionalism was borrowed from and sanctioned by religious behavior among whites in the South, and that the Negro trait of audaciousness is characteristic of white Southerners too. He quoted black scholar and later statesman Ralph Bunche, "White Southerners employ many of the defense mechanisms characteristic of the Negro. They often carry a chip on the shoulder. They indulge freely in self-commiseration. They rather typically and in real Negro fashion try to overcome a feeling of inferiority by exhibitionism, raucousness in dress, and exaggerated self-assertion."
Being overly loud, showing out, overdoing it with the outfits, the makeups, right? Wanting to show everyone that they're in the building, right? Overhyping oneself. Wanting to put the black on everything, right? The black vegan, the black owned business, black entertainment, black travel groups, all these things that other people don't excessively do is at its core an attempt to overcome that feeling of inferiority, which was made manifest during slavery, right? And then it was passed down from the parents to the child all the way up to this day, right? And the thing is that most people on the outside, they can see this as clear as day, right? Even if they don't say anything. Right. And I'm on the outside, and so I can see it too. Right. And so it sticks out like a sore thumb.
The neglect and disdain of education found among antebellum white Southerners had been echoed not only in low performance levels among ghetto blacks, but perhaps most dramatically in a hostility toward those black students who are conscientious about their studies, who are accused of acting white, a charge that can bring anything from social ostracism to outright violence.
That's why you have to stop identifying as being black, and that's why you have to get away from much of the black culture, right? It's an identity and a culture of the pit, right? And so the norms and the culture values in there, it make it hard for you to get out of the pit, right? And so that identity and that culture, that was meant to be transitional, right? It was never meant to be a permanent thing, right? And so you have to understand that that particular consciousness that developed from the slavery experience, it has been in the process of evolving, right? And becoming something new and something greater. And so it's just like when you have hard times in your own life. And once you learn the lessons and then you get through those hard times, you make yourself a better person, right? And so it's only through those hard times and only through those hard times that you're able to have the opportunity to even make yourself become a better person, right? And so the slavery and the black culture and the black identity, that was just an experience required for the consciousness to evolve into something greater.
So much attention has been paid to questions of ability that few have looked at cultural attitudes. One of those who has is black professor and best-selling author Shelby Steele, who sees in many of these children almost a determination not to learn, even though, once outside the school and in their own neighborhoods, these same children learn everything.
A determination not to learn what? All the things that would help them get out of the pit. You see, one of the things that I realized is that most people, they don't have a learning problem. But what they do have is a problem learning the things that they don't care about, right? And the things that they don't want to learn, right? And so I had a lot of friends in the inner city who dropped out of high school, right? And they dropped out because they didn't want to learn about the things that were being taught, right? But some of the people that I knew, they were super crafty when it came to things like stealing cars, stealing bikes, selling weed, right? Breaking into homes. I mean, they could tell you about these things all the way down to the details. And it's like, man, you must have spent some serious time learning about this stuff, right? And so I had one friend who would break into people's homes and he would break into homes to steal video games, right? And so this was around when we were about 14 years old. And so what he would do is he would figure out who had the video games, which door and which window they left open, what time they left home. And then what he would do is he would go and rob the house or hit a lick. That's what we called it back then, right? And so the crazy thing about it is that he was doing this to people that he knew. And so what he would do is he would become friends with people. And then when they would invite him over to their house, they didn't know that he was plotting on their goods and services, right? But that was exactly what he was doing. And so he became highly intelligent in this area, right? And I don't think he went past the 10th grade. Right. But he had a PhD in robbing houses from people that he knew. And so the truth is that people, they can learn anything that they want to learn. But you have to understand that there's some things that people just don't want to learn. And so let's go ahead and go back to see what Professor Shelby Steele was saying about the blacks not wanting to learn.
He drew on his own experiences teaching at a university. For some years, I have noticed that I can walk into any of my classes on the first day of the semester, identify the black students, and be sadly confident that on the last day of the semester, a disproportionate number of them will be at the bottom of the class, far behind any number of white students of equal or even lesser ability.
And so there you have it. And so now is the final phase of freedom and the time to climb all the way out of the pit and enter into the free world where life is much better and it makes much more sense, right? And so this is the end of part 4 commentary on the book here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. And my name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on the other side.